Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm so delighted that the room is full and we feel your presence tonight on an occasion that is so well timed. The High Holy Days are behind us. The election is coming. But we need to continue to educate ourselves, ask the right questions, and to learn all that we can. Not necessarily to determine our vote, but really to determine the future that we can participate in creating together as a community here in Houston and well beyond our borders. Tonight, first, I want to thank Sylvia Wolff and the Wolff-Toomim Education Fund for the Distinguished Lecture Series. It is truly Sylvia's gift to all of us that this distinguished lecture series can happen, and tonight, as I said, so well timed for our purpose. Bret Stephens really doesn't need an introduction, but it's my job. So I'm delighted to say that Bret Stephens, as we know, is a wonderful American journalist, columnist, and editor. He has worked as an opinion columnist for the New York Times and as senior contributor to NBC News since 2017. He also regularly appears as an on-air contributor to NBC News and MSNBC. Since 2021, Bret Stephens has been an inaugural editor-in-chief of SAPER, a journal of Jewish conversations. Stephens was previously a foreign affairs columnist and deputy editorial page editor at the Wall Street Journal, overseeing the editorial pages of its European and Asian editions. At the Journal, Bret Stephens won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2013. Previously, he was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post from 2002 to 2004. He earned his undergraduate degree in political philosophy from the University of Chicago, followed by a master's degree in comparative politics at the London School of Economics. Bret Stephens' book, America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder, was released in November 2014. In it, he argues that the U.S. has been retreating from its role as the world's policeman in recent decades, which will lead to ever greater world problems. Bret Stephens is married to the New York Times music critic. They have 3 children, and they live in New York City. And without further ado, I'm very delighted to welcome our guest to Congregation Beth Israel and to Houston, Bret Stephens.
Rabbi, thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you for coming out tonight. It's really a delight to be back in Houston. I have many friends in this city, all of them named Stein, or at least 2 of them over in that corner. But it's great to see you. It's great to see you again. Great to be here. I'm going to speak in 3 parts, if I may. I'm going to first talk about the United States and the world. Then I'm going to talk about Jews in the world. And then when we get to the Q&A part, you're going to ask me who's going to win the election and how can you work at the New York Times. So I'll leave that for the scintillating questions to the very end. So first part, the United States and the world. When I was a child growing up in Mexico City, I had a wonderful middle school teacher, and I was a kind of a bookish kid. I loved dates and facts and things like that. And I had a teacher who kind of sensed I had a streak, and she asked me this question, which at the time, or initially struck me as a very simple question, but turned out to be sort of complicated and thought-provoking in a variety of ways. The question was simply this: when did World War II begin? Now, because I loved facts and dates, my immediate answer was, well, December 7th, 1941, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Everybody knows this. Then I took this question to my father, and in his way, he pushed me a little further. He said, well, might there not be other dates that are significant? So this is the pre-internet era. I went to a Britannica encyclopedia that we had and started looking into this. And I came back to him, I said, well, there was September 1st, 1939, Germany's invasion of Poland. And he said, well, why don't you push that even further? Why, for instance, did the United States get attacked by Japan and found ourselves in a war in Europe as well? So that led me to another date, September 17th, 1940, not a date that's widely spoken of, but that's the date in which what's called the tripartite agreement was signed by the foreign ministers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Oh, that was another interesting date. Then my dad pushed me a little further. He said, well, what encouraged Hitler to invade Poland in the first place? So that led me to September 30th, 1938. I don't know if any of you recognize that date, but that's the signing of the Munich Agreement and the German takeover of the Sudetenland and the collapse of Czechoslovakia. Oh, that was sort of interesting too. He said, but why was Japan involved in this war? And so this led me to another September date, September, I think, 17th of 1931, something called the Mukden Incident, which is the pretext by which Japan started to invade China. He wasn't done with me. He said, anything else? Again, this is how I was raised. I said, well, I don't know. He said, well, there was a global economic crisis at the time. Maybe that had something to do with it. So that brought me to a date in October of 1929, October 29th, the Tuesday, Black Tuesday, the beginning of the Great Depression. Still wasn't done with me. I went all the way back to June of 1919, June, I think, 28th of 1919, and the signing of the Versailles Peace Conference. Now, what my dad, in his cunning way, was trying to teach me is that when you want to date the origins of a historic or a catastrophic, cataclysmic event, turns out there's no actual starting date. A variety of streams feed this great river of events, which then leads to what happened in the Second World War. And I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about this experience from my childhood, because I think when I think about the origins of the Second World War, I think there are all kinds of parallels to the present in which we find ourselves today. So some dates are familiar instantaneously to all of us here tonight. Obviously, one of the great dates, great as in historically significant dates, is October 7th of 2023. But you only have to go back a little more than a year to get to February 22nd or February 24th of 2022. What happened then? It's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But why did Russia invade Ukraine? Why did it choose to invade Ukraine? In that case, I think you'd have to go back to August 15th of 2021. Well, what happened in August of 2021? Kabul fell to the Taliban in the wake of America's precipitous withdrawal. Okay, so Kabul fell to the Taliban. Well, are there other dates that precede that also should be considered significant? Well, one of them actually went totally unremarked, but exactly 20 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin signed an agreement of what he called unlimited friendship with China. February 4th, treaty of no limits friendship between the People's Republic and the Russian Federation. Another significant date. Fourth date, I would say, you'd have to go to September 15th of 2008, which I know is familiar to many of you because that was the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And if you want to go back even further, I wouldn't go to September 11th, 2001. I would refer you to August of 1998, which was the collapse of the Russian ruble, which paved the way for a little-known, faceless, former FS or KGB agent from St. Petersburg to work his way to the summit of Russian power. Why am I talking about all of these dates? Because the beginning of World War II was really an accumulation of events that seemed to have no obvious connection to one another, but seen in retrospect all contributed to this. The period that we find ourselves in today contains that same accumulation of events. There is an organic connection between what is happening in eastern Ukraine and Russia's invasion and what Hamas chose to do on October 7th. There is a connection we obviously know between what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Lebanon, and what's happening in Yemen. But that's also connected to a wider series of events. For instance, what's happening in the South China Sea. Just last week, China, this almost got no attention, China sent 153 military jets to circle the island of Taiwan as a kind of preparation for an eventual blockade of the island, threatening the question of whether we would come to that island's defense if the Chinese choose to either blockade it or otherwise choose to invade it, which is a subject of real discussion. We have been, in one way or another, in an era of strange economics for the last 15 years, 16 years, owing to the effects of the Great Recession and the way monetary policy and fiscal policy chose to respond to it. This year, 2024, marks an important milestone where our payment on the national debt exceeds all of the money that we will spend for defense. So what I'm trying to kind of convey is that if you're looking for an era that sounds uncannily like the 1930s, look to events in our own day. Two more points that I want to mention just because I think that they're interesting and they're not so frequently remarked on. One is the sudden transformation of technology which took place in the 1920s and 1930s. 2 points in particular. In the 1920s, radios became widely available. What was the first thing that Adolf Hitler did when he came to power in 1933? Well, he burned the Reichstag, but other than that, what did he do? He insisted on placing a radio in the home of every single German house. Every single household had a cheap radio. Why? Because that allowed the leader, the Führer, to have a conversation every night with the people. A disintermediated conversation, to use a fancy word, a conversation that didn't have editors, journalists, or certainly pundits commenting on the nature of the political leader's remarks. Direct communication between the leader and the people. It was an era of media disintermediation. The second massive technological change that happened in the 1920s and 1930s was mobile armor, very different from the static types of defenses and military technology available in the First World War. Suddenly you had tanks that could move across a lot of territory very quickly and almost overnight turned made static types of defenses obsolete. The Maginot Line is the most famous example, supposedly defending the French border against a German invasion. What do you have today? You have disintermediated communication, which allows demagogic and populist leaders to reach millions of people without any editors getting in their way. And you have a second thing, you have a revolution in military affairs where cheaply built and massively produced technologies like drones are able to defeat entire armies and billions of dollars worth of military expenditure. Another resemblance to our present day, not just an era of disorder, not just an era of aggressive authoritarians, but an era where our imagined strengths could crumble overnight, and an era in which political demagoguery has a grip on the public imagination in the way that it hasn't had in nearly 100 years. So this is a kind of overview of where things stand today. It's very difficult to say whether we're reliving 1931 or 1939. I'm not quite sure. But Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, it sure does rhyme. And history is rhyming today. So that is a kind of an overview I wanted to offer you about the state of the world. Now I want to talk a little bit about where Jews, the Jewish people, find ourselves within that world. One of the great stunning facts to contemplate is if you go back just over 100 years into European history, you would find that in 1922, the most important and influential man in Germany was a guy named Walter Rathenauer. The most important scientist in Germany was Albert Einstein. The most important doctor in Germany was Otto von Meyerhoff. And the most important philosopher in Germany was Edmund Husserl. Guess what they all had in common? All of them Jews. In the 1920s, fully 1/3 of all German Nobel laureates were Jewish. By 1933, that had all ended. There is a tendency in Jewish history, and you can go back to previous eras, in which our zenith as a people also winds up being our precipice. And the transition from the 1920s and the 1930s is is a warning for all of us here about how quickly things can change. Now let me talk a little bit about the present here in the United States, because I feel like many of us, certainly in the last year, certainly since October 7th, have sensed that transformation. And there are a couple questions that are worth asking about it. First one is, what is the nature of that transformation? Where's it going? How bad is it going to get? Is it as bad as we think it might be? This set of questions of where we are going toward. But there's a just as equally important prior set of questions of, well, how exactly did we reach this moment? How did we get here so blithely unaware of how our colleagues, our neighbors, our people in other professional associations actually felt about Jewish interests, Jewish sensitivities, Jewish pain? Where did this all come from? And I think for most people, unless you were kind of in the Woody Allen school of hearing the word Jew in every iteration of unless you came out of that school, it's a shock, and it's not surprising it's a shock. All you have to do is go back to the 1990s, and it's amazing how Jewish culture in America was really American culture. What was the greatest show of the 1990s? It was Seinfeld. Who is the fictional star of the movie Clueless? It's a girl named Cher Horowitz, right, with her lawyer father who's so proud that she managed to argue her way from a C to an A. It's one of the great movies of all time, in case you haven't seen it. Who is the greatest director in the United States in the 1990s? Steven Spielberg. Who is the maestro of monetary policy? It's Alan Greenspan. Go down the list. Jewish culture in the 1990s was indistinguishable from American culture. We were completely at home in this society. So what is it that began to change? How did the ground start to crumble beneath our feet? My theory is this. We did not suddenly import anti-Semitism into America. Our neighbors did not suddenly start to think, those Jews, enough of them, right? They didn't become our enemies overnight. But what happened was that tenets, long-standing tenets of American culture, American belief, did start to change. And they didn't start to change in ways that were anti-Semitic. They started to change in ways that were anti-Semitic adjacent. What are the anti-Semitic adjacencies as I see them? Well, one of them, this word privilege. You heard the word privilege? Your kids have heard the word privilege if they're in college, or your grandchildren have heard this word privilege. Check your privilege. Now, privilege is an interesting word. Obviously, we're all in some sense profoundly privileged to be American citizens, to be, have access to a certain standard of living. I'm not denying all that. But privilege has an interesting relationship with the word success. Privilege is something you did not earn. Success is something you did earn. Privileged people don't deserve what they have. Successful people do. So this quiet transformation from a concept of privilege to a concept of success had knock-on effects for many Americans, but had particular knock-on effects for the Jewish people. Why is that? Why is it that Jews did so well in the United States in a way that we didn't do well in other European democracies, France, Great Britain, certainly Germany, to say the least, right? Why is it? Because oddly enough, when America was founded, it was founded on a Calvinist doctrine that worldly success was a sign of divine favor. It's amazing. An anti-Semitic preacher from Geneva from the 16th century came up with this doctrine, and the Puritans brought it with them on the Mayflower to the United States. Those who succeed on earth must be doing something right in the eyes of God. And so their success was not envied or hated or suspected. Their success was admired. So for 350 odd years, Jewish success in America opened doors for us. It begat admiration in the society at large. Not all at once, not uniformly, but as American Jews started doing better and better, we were admired more and more. Change the notion of success to the notion of privilege, and suddenly we go from being a minority that people want to emulate to being a minority that has these rewards and riches that somehow they didn't earn. So that was an anti-Semitic adjacency number one. Your kids started talking about privilege, and suddenly people started looking around saying, well, who's privileged in society? That was one. Second one, the war, particularly in the last 20 years, on unorthodox thinking. The war on being, thinking, acting different, on being the skeptic, the gadfly, the iconoclast. It is in our cultural DNA as Jews that when other people say yes, we say, really? And when other people say no, we say, why not? That's the way our culture operates. It's a culture that values the child who asks difficult questions, who values the person who stands a little bit outside of the tradition, not to tear it down, but at least to interrogate it. This is one of the reasons why Jews in academia have so outperformed, because from the very beginning, before we ever get to any school, we're asking questions. We're having arguments with our parents, and our parents are inviting that argument. The last 20 years, skepticism in the United States went from being a virtue to being a defect. So go to any college campus in America, and certainly the elite college campuses. Who are the faculty members who find themselves feeling like they're on the outs? Who are the students who find themselves feeling like they're on the outs? It's overwhelmingly Jewish students who feel this way. 2 more points. One is the relentless racialization of, or the rise of identity politics and the relentless racialization, racial categories in American life. My mother was a hidden child during the Holocaust. She was hunted because she was allegedly non-Aryan, non-white. Today, my mother is, quote, white passing in the language of DEI seminars, and now she's on the wrong side of the racial divide, too. I mean, she's too old to care, but that's true for her grandchildren. Whenever racial discourse becomes a dominant discourse, however well-intended, in the life of a society, Jews will find themselves on the wrong side of that divide. And the final point that I want to make is the rise of conspiracy thinking in the United States. What is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism isn't simply a prejudice against Jews. It's a conspiracy theory about Jews. What did the Jews do? They connived with the Romans to kill Christ. What did the Jews do? They poisoned the wells. What did the Jews do? Their control of media and finance caused world wars. What did the Jews do? Their control of Hollywood debased morals. What are the Jews doing now? They are replacing hardworking Americans with illegal Hispanic immigrants so that we can get more cheap labor. That's the allegation. Anti-Semitism always takes the form of a conspiracy theory. Now, again, look back at the last 20 years. What has happened in American political discourse? Conspiracy theories have become absolutely ubiquitous. So some people believe that Donald Trump is a Russian agent. Some of you might believe Trump is a Russian agent. Some people believe Barack Obama was born in Kenya or wherever, and that the birth certificate is fake. Some people believe the 2020 election was stolen. Some people believe Bill Gates is injecting microchips into the arms of honest Americans so he can monetize their bodily functions. People believe anything about anything these days. The problem with that is that when people will believe anything about anything, they will believe the worst about Jews. And so it's not a surprise that in this land of conspiracy theories, suddenly we see the explosion of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, thinly wrapped in language about Zionism in Israel, but they're fundamentally anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So that is how, in the main, we arrived here. We allowed into mainstream American thinking a set of ideas that were antithetical to the ideas that the founders and the best American heroes brought with them. That idea that success is something to be admired, that what matters is the content of your character, not the color of your skin or any form of identity, that we should value rationality, and that we should always listen to the dissenting voice. Those ideas that were once so fundamentally American are now shifting away from us. And that, I think, is the deeper cause of the new anti-Semitism that everyone here in this room is beginning to experience either at first hand or at second hand. Now the question then is, where are we going from now on? Is this a kind of a high watermark for anti-Semitism? Is it a function of the war that Israel is waging against its enemies? Is this going to recede? I had a debate a few years ago for the American Jewish Committee in New York, and I debated a wonderful scholar by the name of Pamela Nadell. She's the only person at the hearing of the 3 university presidents who didn't lose her job. I guess the MIT president still has her job, but wonderful scholar. But she was basically making the case that American Jews shouldn't get that worried. We have seen previous waves of anti-Semitism. It has ebbed and flowed over the years with some of the cultural tides. If it wasn't the anti-Semitism of the far left today, you had the Crown Heights riots in the 1990s, you had the KKK in the 1960s and 1950s. It's come and gone. And the basic argument is, of course, we have to be on our guard. Of course, we have to be a united community. But America remains a golden Medina for the Jewish people. I am not so sure. I am not so sure for a variety of reasons. Number one, the most potent form of anti-Semitism today has found a very cunning disguise in the language of anti-Zionism. It has found a handful of allies within the Jewish community who are willing to speak the language of anti-Zionism to better disguise that form of anti-Semitism. But what you find is that the tropes that anti-Zionists use about Israel and those of us who support Israel are exactly the same tropes that anti-Semites used 100-odd years ago to talk about the Jews. Limitless bloodlust, greed, secret control over the levers of world power, an effort to dominate not just a region, but an entire world, and the belief that if only you could get rid of this Jewish blot, world hunger would be solved. Other problems would be addressed. What anti-Semites believe the eradication of the Jews brings about the coming of a Messiah, a new era, a new kind of purity, is what anti-Zionists believe today about Israel and Israel's supporters. So the language of anti-Zionism has become extraordinarily potent on every college campus in America. It is an infection that is touching almost every young mind today, and it is going to spread. It is going to spread beyond the quads at Yale and Harvard and Berkeley and Michigan and other schools, and it has become more and more dominant. And what's so terrifying to me today is that the old anti-Semitism, whether it was Louis Farrakhan or David Duke, was coming from the gutter, was coming from the cultural sewers, and everyone knew it. The new anti-Semitism, calling itself anti-Zionism, is coming from the commanding heights of American culture. It is going to spread. It is going to get worse. Second thing I fear is that the United States is fundamentally rethinking the way in which we want to conduct ourselves in the world. It used to be a bipartisan consensus that America had a moral responsibility to embattled free people on the far edges of the world to help defend themselves. It used to be our belief that our commitments at the farther edges of the world, whether it was in West Berlin or in Panmunjom on the Korean peninsula, or today in Ukraine and Taiwan, we used to think that this was what made America the unique country that we are, that gave us our moral power and that ultimately redeemed the American enterprise. Americans don't think that anymore. It's true that one side wants to defend one corner of the world, another side wants to defend a different corner of the world, but there is increasingly a bipartisan consensus in the United States that the only country that really fundamentally matters to us is this one, and that what happens outside is someone else's concern. If you want to talk about echoes of the 1930s, hear the echoes of America First, by the way, a both left and right-wing movement in 1940, and the echoes to the isolationism that you have today. And the third thing that concerns me is where the Jewish community is. The Jewish community is late. It's late. It's only in the last year or so that all of us through one experience or another have been shocked to our core about what our community has experienced. I was just told about your new fence. I don't know how much it costs, but you clearly need it. You can't, I've been speaking at synagogues all over the country, every single one of them has to invest heavily in security. I go on college campuses. I speak to students. They're bewildered. They don't know what is happening to them. They don't know what country this could be. That the Jewish girl with a Jewish last name is the only one in her dorm who has Palestinian propaganda shoved under her door, or that the faculty, except when they're under pressure from angry alumni, are not only indifferent, but they're actually in sympathy with the people who are harassing the Jewish students. The Jewish community is late in getting its act together. How do we get our act together? Well, there's a lot you can do in terms of investment, whether it's in physical infrastructure or in community relations or philanthropy. But ultimately, the way in which a community gets its act together is it decides that being a part of that community is the single best and most important thing that they can do with their lives. Not just on the sides, on the margins of their everyday existence, but the single thing that defines who it is that they are. A few years ago, I think an ABC journalist wrote a book called 10% Happier. He took up meditation after a freak out on TV. It's a great title, 10% Happier. My wife had it on the bedside. I was like, oh, interesting title. The argument is you don't have to completely transform your life, just try to make yourself a little bit happier. How do we become 10% Jewier? How does each one of you, ask yourself, if I could be 10% Jewier, whether it's in your attendance at shul, or your philanthropic giving, or the way in which you just approach your vacations, or any number of relatively minor decisions that you make in your life, your curiosity not just about Judaism as a religion, but Jewishness as a culture and a civilization and a tradition and a history, how do you start to change that and move in that direction? How do you convince your kids and your grandkids that this thing, your Jewishness, is the single most priceless inheritance that you've ever received and that you could possibly give to them? How do you do that? I don't know. I know that the question has to simply be planted in the heads of every Jew so that they ask themselves, well, what is it that I'm going to do with my life, with my Jewishness? How am I going to make sure that it doesn't end with me because I was too indifferent or too busy to care about this as the central thing in my life? Again, I pose the question to you. I don't possess an answer, but I possess an anecdote, which is the one I'm going to close with. This is now maybe a year ago, after it was in November, there was a scene that somehow got captured on drone footage or some kind of video footage of a Jewish student walking through Harvard Yard. And he was surrounded and he was being harassed by and intimidated by anti-Israel, I never call them pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel hecklers, demonstrators. And my mother was watching this footage. I was sitting next to her. You know, she's an elderly woman now and not very mobile. She was watching this. She could not believe what she was seeing. She could not believe that this country, which took her as a displaced person at the age of 10 with $7 to her name, that this could be happening in the citadel of American learning, or the supposed citadel of American learning. She looked at me and she said, Bret, I was born in hiding. I'm not going to die in hiding. So she got herself an Israeli flag and she hung it from her door. In your own ways, find that same expression. In your own way, find that same courage. Find that same sense of purpose and meaning not just to redeem the sacrifice of everyone who came before you to give the life that you have, but in order to ensure that your children and grandchildren and many succeeding generations have the same privilege as well. Thank you.
Do you want to take this? Okay. Around a subject that is so important to all of us. You know, obviously talk the talk and walk the walk, and have been writing about so much of this, and all of us have been reading about so much of what you've been writing and reporting on. David Scott is collecting some questions for us. I'm sure, since I know the congregation and the community well, there are many reasons to be so concerned. Bret, let's begin. Is there a place for optimism? Is there just not to skirt over or to wash over any of the concerns that we will also address more deeply with you, because we are also a congregation of question askers. Where's a shred of hope or optimism, as Dr. Nadel talked about it?
You know, I've been speaking at congregations for like well over 20 years, and I know that the only way to disappoint an audience is with optimism. You know, to quote Woody Allen, it's always darkest before it goes absolutely black. Look, there are 2 points for optimism, and I'm glad you're raising this. There is, of course, one huge difference between the 1930s and the present. And that is that we have the state of Israel, and that Jews would make the mistake, Israelis would make the mistake of letting October 7th happen, but there would be no October 8th, October 9th. If Hamas had had its way, they would have continued until they would have eliminated every Jew they could get their hands on. So the fact that Israel is present, powerful, willful, and most importantly, prepared to defy world opinion in order to assure the safety of its citizens is the single greatest cause for optimism today. The second aspect, just more briefly, is hopefully we have the benefit of historical memory. Although you know, you and I were discussing in your office earlier today just how quickly that fades. You know, if you were to take a kind of an account of Jewish America today, you would say, you know, Bret, what are you talking about? The Senate Majority Leader is Jewish, the Secretary of State is Jewish, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Homeland Security, Chief of Staff to the President, 8 other US Senators, 6 of the 10 richest Americans. We're doing great. Relax. And that's why I always mention the state of German Jews on the eve of the Third Reich. What German Jews failed to think through, at least two things. They did not see just how fragile the democratic institutions of the time were, or even any of the institutions of the time were, until Kristallnacht, until the shattering of the glass. And their other mistake was to imagine, in addition to the political question, that civilization had marched past the era of the pogrom. Civilization never marches past the era of the pogrom. We should reckon with that, and we should reckon with it now while we still have economic and political power in the United States. We need to make use of it, and I think we're not doing it as fully as we should.
So I hear you say that in a democratic nation, we have protection, so to speak, by virtue of the role that each of us can play within society. Although you mentioned communication as a diabolical means of reaching into our homes and into our heads, and today without any mediator, without any filter at all. So we live in a democratic nation. We're doing pretty well as Jews. I've said to my congregation, this is not 1930, because we have the ADL, AJC, and many other reasons to be hopeful that there are organizations, institutions to support us. Maybe I'm too optimistic.
Look, the paradox of pessimism is that pessimists, so long as they're not fatalists, are more alert to danger. I generally think it's a good thing to be pessimistic in your outlook, because pessimists look down and make sure they don't stumble, and optimists have their head in the sky and tend to fall on their face. We can in fact, by the way, we can borrow strategies from other minorities to change the way in which Jews are regarded in this country. Look, what is the Jewish personality, or what has the Jewish personality, I mean, I'm speaking obviously in very broad strokes, been in the United States for the last 40 years? We're funny, we're neurotic, we're kind of accessible, generous, successful, but always giving of ourselves. You know, the Jewish political personality in America has been, or the strategy has been a strategy of ingratiation. We want to make ourselves liked. What we really should want is to make ourselves respected. And respect also means taking no crap when crap is being delivered. So, you know, when a Penn or a Harvard or a Columbia decides to hold some shambolic event trying to illustrate how they're now alert to the dangers of anti-Semitism, but it's also, you know, an event about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, you know that you're being spoon-fed nonsense, right? They're not taking you seriously. Things begin to change when donors say, you know what? Columbia used to be great. We're now giving our money to institutions that really understand and value a Jewish presence, that value genuine viewpoint diversity, that don't treat Jews as just white, adjacent, rich people who will name buildings and otherwise not care about the governance of the school. And in so many institutions where we have a say, we need to speak out. You know, we should model ourselves on Black America. Black America didn't rest with the end of Jim Crow, right? They wanted to get rid of racism as an acceptable prejudice to have at every level. And we accept casual anti-Semitism all the time. Well, he's just anti-Zionist, you know, I'm sure he doesn't mean to be anti-Semitic. We're having these conversations with ourselves. No, you should say, you know what? You're free to think what you think, but what you think is anti-Semitic, we want nothing to do with you. We're not gonna open our wallets to you. We're not gonna participate in your events. There are things that we can do simply to assert our pride as a Jewish community that doesn't accept casual denigration.
Well, we really appreciate that. You've addressed the subject of Jewish self-respect, which is something we haven't really articulated or defined very well in recent years, but it's becoming more and more important. I think one of the ways that we develop Jewish self-respect, if you could talk a little bit about the role of what we need to do to become what Daniel Gordis calls the new Jew. In this generation. We're not the self-deprecating, passive Jew of the past, and we have to become something more.
Look, the most self-respecting Jews in my mind are Israelis. And my cousins who are now, or their children in the IDF, defending the state, defending their brothers, searching for hostages. I have nothing but the highest respect for what it is that they're doing. And every time they are even casually slandered, it has to be vocally and meticulously and forcefully opposed, because the casual slander of Israel is, oh, yes, of course Israel has the right to defend itself, but it has to do so in certain ways, et cetera, et cetera. What's the proudest day in American history? It's June 6, 1944. Everyone in this room knows June 6, 1944, okay? The United States, on its proudest day, bombed and probably killed about 25,000 French civilians in the bombing of Normandy. Now, that is a tragedy, and those were innocent civilians. But we were pursuing a just cause against the most malevolent evil that the world has ever seen. So let's have some historical perspective about what happens when you are fighting an enemy that cynically fights behind, between, and beneath its own civilians. People say, oh, how dare you compare Hamas to the Nazis? No, I'm sorry, Hamas is worse. Not in matters of scale, but the Nazis hid their crimes. The Hamas put it on GoPro. They put it on GoPro. They wanted the world to see it. I watched that 43-minute video of what Hamas was doing, never mind to Jews, to Thai farm workers. It's the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. And by the way, the Nazis did not, in fact, hide behind their own civilian populations. They tried to move civilians out of cities they knew were being bombed. People should recognize the pure, cynical, bottomless evil that Hamas represents and that the IDF is now fighting. And Hezbollah is exactly the same story. Anyway.
No, absolutely. I appreciate.
Can I just want to make one more point, maybe more apropos here? So this goes back, 15 years. I was at a shul. I was the speaker at a shul in Cleveland. And so there was a reception before the talk, and it was, like what you'd expect at a shul crowd, nice Jewish doctors and lawyers and members of the shul. There was this one young Chinese woman. She introduced herself. She was from Shanghai. She was doing a degree at Case Western. So, when you're at these receptions, you make conversation. I said, well, what brings you here? It's not always that you find someone from China at a conservative shul in Cleveland. So she said, she had a thick accent, but she said, we Chinese know that Jews are the smartest people in the world. And I was like, oh, come on, please, it's such a trope, it's a stereotype. She stared at me very intently. She said, no, Jews, smartest in world. And then she rattled off Nobel percentages, including the disproportion of our overall number in world society versus what we were getting in physics and chemistry and whatever. So she was playing a kind of a Jewish, Trivial Pursuit with me. And I may be misremembering. I almost feel she was like pointing her finger into my chest. She was like, you guys are amazing, You should value these accomplishments. Now, we don't want to be sort of boastful, but we have a lot to be proud of. I've always thought, I don't want to say get rid of, but this whole business of the Holocaust Museum being the central emblem of Jewish life in America is wrong. We need a museum of Jewish awesomeness, right, on the mall with different exhibits, like The Weekend. We gave you that, right, among other bequests. We did that. Some Jew thought, on the sixth day you rest, so on the seventh day you rest. So there you go. That's what.
Well, that's Jewish optimism. That's helping us to see more than we give ourselves credit for, and other people should take note too. I like that finger pointing in your chest. And Shanghai was a good place for the Jews in the past. So you did also speak about helping other generations recognize what they need to know about being self-respecting Jews. And if you look around the room tonight, our youngest people aren't here. Many of you are. And if you are among the youngest, I'm proud of you and very grateful that you're here to listen to something so important. But how is it, there's a question here, how did American academia, where our young people are going, we're spending a lot of money to send them there, how did American academia, which should teach idea diversity, become so resistant to other ideas?
I have a theory. It's a pet theory, but I think there's some truth to it, that every profession winds up attracting exactly the people who should not be in that profession. So like all therapists, present company accepted, like all therapists are neurotics who should be in therapy, right? You know, all of our so-called public servants in politics are malignant narcissists, should be nowhere near politics. And all of our people who should be honest pedagogues leading students to at least question assumptions and think more widely about the world are, in fact, narrow-minded activist ideologues who thought that their lane would be a tenure track at, you know, I keep picking on Columbia, but, you know, say Yale to other mediocre schools. That's not a joke. They're awful. But most students at Columbia these days, according to The Atlantic, can't read a book. These are the people busy holding their banners. So the question was,
so how did these places that were supposed to prize diversity become so anti the other idea?
Look, the ideal of the liberal university is a very difficult one to sustain by its nature, because liberalism asks you to hold in tension two impulses which, if they don't contradict, they pull at one another. One is a kind of consuming skepticism, including a self-skepticism. The other is confidence that the skeptical mind is the best way of being, right? And that's what liberalism asks of us, right? In a sense, it's the Jewish proverb about, you know, in one pocket, the world was made for you, in the other pocket, you're but dust and ashes. And so that was always difficult to do. And if you actually look at the history of universities, illiberalism and illiberal tendencies sweep those universities time and again. But I think the most recent history is that from 1968 onwards, the radicals who wanted to turn the university from a safe space for thought took over and made them safe spaces from thought, because they had a particular viewpoint, particularly in social sciences and the humanities, that they wanted to press. And because of tenure and because of the self-selecting system of academia, they drew in bad apples, and everyone else who might have otherwise been tempted by an academic career, you know, ended up, you know, working for, I don't know, Goldman or, you know, places like that, elsewhere. There's a lot of brilliance outside of academia. And I don't know how you repair it. I've thought about this a lot. I mean, one of the ways is you can reward those schools that are consciously making efforts to insist on institutional neutrality, genuine viewpoint diversity, getting rid of ideology in the classrooms. And you see there are academic leaders who are doing just that on the model of the University of Chicago where I went. Daniel Diermeyer at Vanderbilt is a great example. We were talking about Tulane earlier. I think all these will be great schools. I mean, like the top tier schools in 30 years, when all the successful Jews they've graduated end up, you know, giving them huge bequests, and then that'll ruin those schools and we'll have to go elsewhere.
Very good. I have another question in my mind, which I'll hold, and I hope I remember, but you've been speaking about those who are in academia and the college students who are going. The question here is, do you have any comments about recent commentary about the effect of non-college educated working class people? How are they participating in this conversation that we're struggling with, and what impact are they having more than ever before?
You know, Richie Torres, who's this wonderful congressman from the Bronx, he's black, Latino, gay, and should be like to the left of AOC. Instead, he has his moral universe is robust and clear. So I said to him, he took me out to lunch in the Bronx one day. He's an incredible guy, brilliant. I said, Richie, like, you have such a clear worldview. Like, where does this come from? He said, well, I dropped out of college. By the way, I think this is going to be a more and more promising avenue in the future. The idea that college is the necessary gateway to respectability, wealth, success, I think that's more and more a ridiculous idea. I mean, I have 2 kids now in college, and I look at what they're studying, I'm like, I'm paying $83,000 a year for this? Are you kidding me? Like, go find a trade or something. And I hate to be optimistic, but here's something that is actually a source of optimism. In America, even great institutions are allowed to fail. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it takes a long time, but democratic societies, by virtue of their openness, by virtue of the experimentation that's happening all the time, are genuinely involved in the act of all kinds of creative destruction. What we may be witnessing now is the creative destruction of the 4-year college model as a kind of a mainstream model for most American, at least middle-class American kids to have. That's not a bad thing. It's happening, by the way, in other institutions too. Things like Substack allow talented voices to have large media platforms outside of the traditional media organizations. My dear friend Barry Weiss started a Substack. I think now the Free Press has more subscribers than like the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle combined, and more power to her. So a lot is being created, and one point I would say to you is, like, many of you in this audience took in your professional lives great risks, right? You placed crazy bets. You did things that even put your financial safety at risk because you had an idea or a vision. You should do that in your philanthropic life too. You should think individually about how you become a leader of a new initiative, an idea where you can shape the product in a specific and creative way and make that the central part of your identity. I mean, you mentioned Sapir, my quarterly journal. Now, I work for this newspaper, but I'm really passionate about the Jewish future. And I wanted to do something about it that went beyond what I was able to do in my, better known professional life. So I started this quarterly journal. It's called Sapir, and the subtext is Ideas for a Thriving Jewish Future, because that's the way in which I feel I can contribute. But there should be 1,000 of these ships being launched by some of you in this room. I don't know what it is. You're Jews. You'll come up with something.
Well, you answered another question, which was because you ended your talk with how we need to be 10% Jewier. And I think you just answered my question. That is how you are 10% Jewier. Sapir really allows you to be more inventive, more creative, and perhaps even being a columnist at the New York Times.
The column is a wonderful platform, and I don't want to understate the extent to which having space in the New York Times allows me to get a message across to audiences that, in my view, should hear it. And I have the benefit that they let me have my say with a reach that is difficult to achieve elsewhere.
Bret, one of the questions we often get, I get it directly to me. We've had other presenters here in the congregation, and it's often asked. I'd like to get your view. You mentioned communication, the internet, unmediated, and the question very often is put this way: how will Israel or the Jews win the media war?
We won't. We won't, because media is now social media, by and large. And social media is a game based on mass, numbers. And our adversaries are much more numerous than we are. So, you can get a tweet that's viral in the Jewish world may reach 1,000 sets of eyes. A tweet that goes viral in the other universe reaches 100 times that number. And let's be honest, the problem is that the Jews lack for good communication skills. The problem is anti-Semitism, right? Much of the narrative that's being offered now about what's happening in the war comes from, I don't want to say exclusively, but a lot of it comes from an anti-Semitic impulse. And I'll give you an example of this. So I was asked to speak at Harvard. Reluctantly, I agreed. And so I get these questions, like these half-bright questions from half-bright students. And one of them stands up. This is at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He says, in the book of Matthew, we are told to turn the other cheek. And so why can't Israel just turn the other cheek? And I said, Eric Hoffer once said that Israel is the only country in the world expected to behave like a Christian nation. It was a classic expression of anti-Semitism, kind of in this insouciant ways coming forth from the lips of a Harvard student. And that's not easy to beat. But you can do this. You can make people respect you. Mm-hmm. If Israel's going to get through this war, people say, oh, it has to make this and that concession if it wants to achieve peace with Saudi Arabia or gain friendship of other countries. No, it needs to win. Mm-hmm. Because the Saudis aren't interested. The Saudis aren't interested in alliance with Israel because suddenly the crown prince has been reading, Talmud and is like, oh, this is fantastic, right? He's like, those Israelis get the job done. They are successfully defeating our common enemies. They are proving that a small country with limited resources can grow its GDP by multiples by using something other than the oil that's in the ground. And that's what they admire. And that's what we should be. What Israel has done at its best is insist on respect. If you insist on respect, you might one day get love. But if all you ask for is love, you're not going to get love, you're not going to get respect, and this is true in your private life also.
Right, thank you. We also know that in the Middle East, we tend to export our American expectations into a neighborhood that is wholly different than, and I mean that with a WH at the beginning, wholly different than American, our Western understanding. We know that Israel needs to be a bully in the region in order to gain that respect. We've also heard that Israel will win this issue with small victories, but not necessarily a victory with a big capital V. Would you respond to that?
Look, there is no victory with a big capital V. We thought we had won the Cold War, right? Remember that? Berlin Wall came down. We all assured ourselves we had won. Here we are, Vladimir Putin, axis of evil, et cetera, et cetera. That's just life doesn't give you that, okay? What life gives you is the possibility for breathing room. What Israel has been doing since its inception was winning wars imperfectly so it could continue to grow and thrive. And it went from essentially being a third world nation. I mean, even when I first went to Israel 41 years ago, just to make a phone call was a massive ordeal, right? I mean, it was an interesting but essentially a poor country. The transformation has been astonishing. When I was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, this is now going back more than 20 years, there was a similar sense of grim pessimism. Suicide bombings in my neighborhood, both my neighborhood cafes got blown up. My wife had a close call. One of my reporters was grievously injured. It was a bleak time. Israel went on to defeat the Second Intifada, and what followed were 18 years of astounding prosperity. Now we're going to defeat Hamas and Hezbollah, not perfectly. We're never going to get rid of the ideological and fanatical impulses of radical Islamism, right? And once that happens, there will be more breathing room and more possibilities to strengthen your society. Look, 20 years ago, it was unimaginable that Israel would be able to achieve this thing called ballistic missile defense. Earlier this month, Iran fired 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, and they were effectively all shot down, thanks in part, I should add, to the help of the administration. But it was Israeli ingenuity that did that. And Israeli ingenuity and resilience is going to keep it a perpetual step ahead of its enemies, God willing.
Right, right. This question, in the 30s, Jews could go to America. Where can we go to be safe from if anti-Semitism were to get as bad? You talked a little bit about it in your talk, but perhaps you could maybe give some, I'm not asking you to give an optimistic answer to it, but we're going home to Meyerland, Bel Air, and Westview, and other areas north of here. What if things got incredibly worse?
One of my... You can tell from my speech that I have an obsession with obscure trivia. And part of that obsession is I'm really interested in small, remote islands, like Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean. Apparently lovely beaches, although shark-infested. That's a possibility. St. Helena, where Napoleon spent his final days, interesting. Look, I would like to think that the only home you need is Texas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you brought us around to the best answer that we needed to hear, because home is home, and we would like to believe that America is the place where we need to be. And I think, I lived in Israel for a year when I was studying to be a rabbi, and I was convinced then in the springtime that if I needed to live in Israel, I'd be a very happy person living in Israel. I was learning the language and learning the way. But I also discovered that Jews in Israel need Jews in America. The relationship between America and Israel is tight, and it helps to defend and secure the ally that we have there and the land that is ours too.
Look, just very quickly, since you asked, I have a number of commitments in the United States, but if it were up to my wife, we'd be living in Israel right now. And it is a wonderful country. Don't be afraid to visit it. Houston's still more dangerous, okay?
I agree.
Irrespective of all the rockets. It is a fabulous, vibrant, astounding society of courageous people who wake up, send their children to war, protest governments they don't like, participate Jewishly, democratically in the creation of this incredible enterprise, and still have time to have tons of fun. Mm-hmm. It is a country like no other. So make a point among the other ways in which you're 10% Jewier. Don't let your nervous relatives get you down. Go.
Right. Absolutely. And Bret's segue is perfect because we have a scheduled congregational trip to Israel in June. And our purpose is to go there not only to be the typical tourists, but to do supportive mission-style work to lift up the Israelis and let them know that we're there for them. Before we wrap up, Bret, you spoke about the zenith and the precipice, and you used the word arc to describe sort of the period that we are in. Where do you feel that this arc is bending towards? Again, I'm not asking you to be an optimist, but be a realist with us. Where can we possibly expect this arc to lead us in the near future or the long future if we hold fast to many of the lessons and explanations that you provided us tonight?
Look, there's probably a poetic answer, but maybe I love Woody Allen, and by the way, he's not guilty, just for the record, okay? And there's a wonderful scene in Play It Again, Sam. It's my favorite Woody Allen film, where Woody and Diane Keaton are walking through the, I think, MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York. And they come into this big gallery, and Woody spots this sort of interesting-looking woman across the way. And so he plucks up his courage, and he walks over to her, and he says, that's a beautiful Jackson Pollock. What does it say to you? And she says something like, it restates the negativeness of the universe. the hideous, empty loneliness of existence, nothingness, the predicament of man forced to live like a tiny flame flickering in an immense void with nothing but darkness and horror and sorrow. And he goes, what are you doing Saturday night? And she says, hang on, she says, I'm committing suicide. And he looks at her and he says, how about Friday night?
Bret, I can't think of a better way to end tonight, because you've taught us we really do have to hold two distinct ideas in mind at the same time. And sometimes we have to be the optimist, sometimes the pessimist, but we always have to be a realist. And as Jews, we choose life, we look for hope. And if you have an Israeli flag, I think your mother's example is so fine for us. Let's be sure that we are self-respecting, proud Jews today and every day. Bret Stephens, thank you for being here. Thank you.